deflation. Deflation is when numbers go negative. In other words, it's when goods are cheaper than last month or even a year earlier. Can be expressed diagrammatically with a shift in AD1 to AD2. You can see that the price level will fall, and also there will be a fall in real GDP from Y1 to Y2. An example of a country that has experienced deflation is Japan. Japan and its Prime Minister, Shinzo Abe, responded to the situation with reflationary policies. These reflationary policies were called Abenomics. One of these policies was to ease monetary policy. One of the ways they did this was by attempting to devalue the yen, meaning making the currency weaker to stimulate exports. They also introduced a higher inflation target, 2%, just as we have in the UK, to encourage firms to increase output. In other words, as prices go up slightly, this sends an incentive for the firms to expand production and employ more workers. In addition, they employed a fiscal stimulus. That is, there was a big rise in capital spending, such as infrastructure. Fiscal, remember, refers to government spending. Finally, they made structural reforms. So they used supply-side policies to increase productivity. The hope was that by increasing productivity, this would stimulate exports and therefore injections into their economy to ensure that AD was shifting to the right and not to the left. Finally, they decided to increase competition. Increasing competition, it would have a similar effect to productivity. That is, drive down prices, export prices, to make them more competitive in international markets to stimulate exports. Before going any further, it's important to consider what we mean by a real interest rate. A real interest rate is the nominal interest rate minus inflation. In the example above, we have -2. -2 is obviously deflation. And we know that two minuses together will equal a plus. Therefore, the real interest rate will become 6%. Previous point, the debtors' debts will now increase. The real interest rate means that they are having to pay even more money back. Consequently, their confidence will reduce and consumption will decrease further. Other consequences will include lower profit margins. This is because firms cut staff to seek greater profitability. That is, the fall in demand for the goods mean that they cannot employ the same number of workers. Therefore, they must reduce cost to maintain profit. Moreover, because they are now charging a lower price per good, it's likely that revenues will fall. There's obviously implications here for reduced spending on research and development and expansion. Finally, and I know this sounds like very repetitive, but the lower consumer confidence. Clearly, there's going to be a negative wealth effect. That negative wealth effect means that as assets decrease in price, the consumer is going to feel less confident, as will firms, and therefore consumption will decrease further. So what can be done to avoid deflation? Well, the first thing is that higher taxes can be levied on savings to discourage saving and encourage consumption. Monetary policy could be used. The obvious The obvious tool being a reduction in the interest rate. But if the interest rate falls close to zero and consumers are still not purchasing goods and firms are still not investing in capital stock, there needs to be an alternative solution, one of which is quantitative easing. Quantitative easing is simply the central bank buying up private sector assets to stimulate a positive wealth effect. I will do a separate video on quantitative easing. Other options include fiscal stimulus. Fiscal stimulus is when there is an increase in government spending, as per the example of Abenomics on capital projects. And finally, there can be attempts to lower the exchange rate. So this may be a lowering of the interest rate to encourage outflows of hot money from the country, which will obviously depreciate the currency. This leads us to the deflationary spiral. As prices fall, this will mean that consumers defer purchasing goods. Consequently, firms will produce less output. In addition, as the firms produce less output, the workers will be paid lower wages. This will lead to a fall in consumption and a fall in investment. Consequently, a fall in AD. The fall in AD, as unemployment rises, will lead to lower confidence. This will mean that AD shifts to the left and prices will fall further. As prices fall further, wages will have to be cut. This goes round again to a fall in consumption, a fall in investment, and a fall in AD. The cycle continues. There are a couple of problems with deflation. The first is that it discourages consumer spending. When there are falling prices, this often encourages people to delay purchases because they will be cheaper in the future. In particular, it can discourage consumers from buying luxury goods, i.e. non-essential items such as flat screen TVs, because you could save money by simply waiting for the product to become cheaper. Therefore, periods of deflation often lead to lower consumer spending and lower economic growth, as per the example of Japan. It increases the real value of debt. Deflation increases the real value of money and the real value of debt. Deflation makes it difficult for debtors to pay off their debt. Therefore, consumers and firms have to spend a bigger percentage of disposable income on meeting debt repayments. That is, in a period of deflation, firms will also be getting lower revenue and consumers will also likely to get lower wages. Therefore, this leaves less money for spending and investment. There will be increased real interest rates. If there is deflation of 2%, this means we will have a real interest rate of +2. In other words, saving money gives a reasonable return. Therefore, deflation can contribute to an unwanted tightening of monetary policy. Savings will increase, which is a withdrawal from the circular flow, and consumption will. The fourth problem is something called real wage unemployment. We've spoken before about how labour markets often exhibit what Keynes would call sticky wages. In particular, workers resist nominal wage cuts. No one wants to see their wages actually cut, especially when you are used to annual pay rises. Therefore, in periods of deflation, real wages rise. That is, because of deflation, the proportion of your income that you spend on goods and services falls. Now, this is good news if you've maintained your job, but obviously it's going to be challenging for employers. They will not be able to afford to employ as many workers. The real problem of deflation is that deflation can become entrenched and difficult to end. For example, Japan and its difficulty of adapting expectations to regain normal growth. That is, consumers and firms' expectations were built around the idea that prices were going to fall and therefore deferring investment and consumption, consequently leading to recession. The challenge cannot be underestimated in turning the minds of consumers and businesses to the belief that prices should rise and therefore firms should increase output to regain normal growth. Benefits of deflation. First, deflation from increased efficiency and lower costs of production. The right kind of deflation involves lower prices through increased productivity and better technology. In other words, A-level students, aggregate supply is shifting to the right, which both lowers the price level and increases real GDP. Deflation is that it will improve international competitiveness. If one country has deflation and others have inflation, then that country will become more internationally competitive, leading to a rise in exports. During Japan's inflation, they saw strong exports, which helped in part to offset the fall in consumer spending, although that was not sufficient in preventing AD from shifting to the left. The third benefit refers to lower expenditure bills for consumers. So, what this means is that due to deflation, prices of many goods and services fall, which in turn leads to lower expenditure bills for many people, particularly middle and poor people, as this reduces drastically their monthly expenditure. However, it must be pointed out that wealthy people are less likely to benefit from it, as there is likely to be a fall in asset prices, which will lead to a negative wealth effect. Building on point 3, there will also be the benefit of income inequality reduction. That is, deflation hits hard, particularly rich people, in comparison to the poor. That is, deflation reduces the value of the rich people's assets, and therefore this narrows wealth and income gaps. Deflation is that there will be cheap loans. As previously explained, the interest rate will have to be cut to stimulate consumption and investment. However, as we've already explored, just simply because there's been an interest rate cut, it does not mean consumption investment will increase. So the idea that loans are cheap is great, but it's likely to be offset by the high levels of negative confidence.